It's 12 minutes to the hour here on Paris Live PM, and we're coming into the end of our programme today. But this is our segment, as you know, as Live on Live. Now, EU chiefs have blasted Turkey's Nazi comparisons, as we reported on earlier in the programme, with the Netherlands and Germany as detached from reality and incompatible with its ambitions to join the bloc. Now, the leaders' comments came as voters in the Netherlands are casting their ballot in what is regarded as a litmus test of right-wing populism and its strength in Europe, ahead of polls due in France next month and in Germany later this year. Now, the Dutch vote has, of course, as we've been reporting all week, been overshadowed by the blazing diplomatic row over after the government there banned Turkish ministers from addressing a pro-Ankara rally in Rotterdam. Now, in Live on Live this afternoon, I'm joined by Dorothée Schmid, who's an author and academic who heads the Turkey and Middle East Department at the French Institute for International Relations here in Paris. Dorothée, thank you very much for coming back on the programme.
Good afternoon.
Now, let's just have a quick look at what happened last weekend. And this is a question that we've been asking here in RFI for the past few days. Was the move for a foreign minister, Mevlut Cavusoglu, if I pronounce it correctly, was the move for a foreign minister to address a pro-Erdogan rally in the Netherlands an unprecedented move? Or have Turkish diplomats solicited the diaspora in this way in the past?
It has been quite usual for the Turkish politicians actually to campaign on EU soil for the last years, especially since in 2014 they started organizing the vote in Europe. So it's become easier for the Turks from the diaspora to vote. And they're quite mobilized. If you realize that, for instance, we've looked at statistics in France, the Turkish community, on the average, doesn't vote for French election, but they vote at a very high rate for the Turkish one since 2014. So it's become it's an important stake to get the votes from the diaspora.
So, I mean, is this? It's not a recent move that the Turkish population living abroad can actually vote as well when they have an overseas ballot.
They have been able to vote for long, but now in the practical sense, it's become more easy to vote for them. And the Turkish authorities have organized, they had a whole calendar to campaign actually in Europe. So most of these meetings had been planned quite in advance. And the EU governments have reacted on a case-by-case basis.
Yeah.
And the problem is that the whole thing has escalated very quickly last week after first some German cities banning these meetings, then the reaction of the Turkish government labeling them Nazis, and then etc. etc. So it went very quickly, actually.
Well, now let's just to kind of to set the scene here, where it's not unprecedented for politicians to go and to rally the diaspora abroad, but the rally that was going on, that was to take place in Rotterdam, was pro-Erdogan, pro-government, and this is all ahead of the April 16th referendum. Now, can you just explain to our listeners what exactly is at stake in this referendum that's due to take place next month?
The referendum is designed to ensure full power for Erdogan, who has actually been governing alone and has reinforced his grasp on the Turkish society and the political system and the state system, especially ever since there was this coup attempt last July 2016. Now Turkey is under a state of emergency, so the president is obsessed with tightening his grip on power and making sure that the opposition is systematically downplayed. He's labeling most of the opposition terrorists, so there's hardly ever any legal channel to express any dissent.
Well, that's exactly a question, a very interesting question that it's just like, what exactly, what opposition voices are actually getting heard in Turkey ahead of this poll?
That's the problem, is that the electoral campaign is quite unbalanced, because you can see that almost 90% of the media are controlled by the government and the pro-AKP side. And there is obviously a climate of terror in Turkey with the accumulation of terror attacks and the clamping down on especially on the pro-Kurdish side, but also the JP, the Kemalist party, has actually reacted to latest escalation with the EU, saying that they sided with the government, which is quite difficult to understand for us. But there's a sort of nationalistic reaction that keeps all together the Turks against the rest of the world by now.
Well, now this is the other thing. I mean, the European Union President Donald Tusk said that no one could make comparisons between events in Rotterdam and the Nazi period when the city was brutally, this is a quote from him, brutally destroyed by the Germans. Now, this reference to Nazis by Erdogan and accusing the Dutch today only of massacring 8,000 Muslims in Srebrenica is resonant of the tactics used by Vladimir Putin when trying to mitigate his actions in places like Ukraine and Crimea. Now, is the Turkish president, in your opinion, taking notes out of his Russian, the book, a leaf out of the book of his Russian counterpart?
I think the Turks have been working on their own historical narratives for the past 10 years under Erdogan, and they are now building a sort of separate history from the EU. And we never realized that we didn't leave the Second World War in the same way. The Turks joined the war very late. Yeah. They declared war to the Nazis at the very end of the war, and then they were on the Western side during the Cold War, but they don't have the same relationship, the same reactions when you use that sort of rhetoric. It's not as sensitive for them. But they understand that it's extremely sensitive for the EU, which is the point.
Now, the other thing is, Turkish, we look back 18 months ago, Turkish relations, Russian-Turkish relations have, well, let's just say recently, especially since the attempted coup, they've taken a volte face since that attempted coup in July. But Erdogan has now embarked on a crackdown in response to what happened there and is seeking to increase his powers in this referendum next month. Are relations, however, with Russia more important than relations with the EU? Now that Putin really stepped up to the plate to say, look, if you need our help here, they buried the hatchet after that plane was shot down, the Russian plane was shot down.
I think we're now witnessing the sort of second period for the Turkish diplomacy. There was a grand Turkish vision which was elaborated by Ahmet Davutoğlu, who was the former Minister of Foreign Affairs, then Prime Minister, who was sacked by Erdogan on the spring in 2016, before the coup.
Yes.
Because the Turks were becoming more and more isolated on the regional scene. And then there was the reconciliation with Putin. And now the Turks are looking for a sort of more balanced and more Turkey-centered, I would say, outlook.
And of course, we have the negotiations happening, the Syria talks that are being backed by Russia and Turkey in Astana. So they're really trying to make their stamp on the regional, the regional map, I suppose.
Yes, but now that the Syrian rebels have made it clear that they don't want to participate to the talks in Astana, I suppose the Turkish chip is going to get less value, actually, even for the Russians.
Gotcha. Now, let's look back at this spat that really kicked off in earnest at the weekend. For the past 10 to 15 years, have seen Turkey's accession, the accession talks to the EU take precedence in any trade negotiations or on human rights or whatever bartering was coming up. And there's been a long, slow process. But with what's happened over the last 5 days, is this all in the bin now? Any progress that was made within these talks, which were slow-moving, are they all to be forgotten?
I think actually the EU mood changed slowly since 2013 with the big mobilization on the Gezi Park issue, if you remember.
Sure.
And ever since the Germans have taken the lead to sort of reaffirm the basic political principles and the precedence of the state of right in Turkey. So they've been very attentive. But the paradox is that Angela Merkel is one who has negotiated the agreement of Syrian refugees with the Turks, because in her vision, in her mind, it was a way to sort of constrain the Turks to cooperate with the EU.
Well, with what Erdogan has said in the last 24 or 48 hours, does Erdogan have the EU now on the back foot? Does he believe he can just open the floodgates now? We were speaking to our correspondent earlier there who's in Greece. I mean, what will happen?
That's a very interesting point that is, to my mind, quite controversial. I think now most of the Syrian refugees in Turkey have understood that they are not welcome in Europe, so I don't see them swimming desperately back to the Greek coast.
Back to
so I think It's a kind of bluff on the Turkish side to say that they're going to suspend the agreement. I don't think it would produce the same results as a year ago.
No, we have to look at some breaking news that came out today, is that several top Twitter accounts, including those of the German football club, the French ministry here, and BBC North America, they were defaced with pro-Turkish slogans and hackers allegedly pro-Turkish with messages slamming them as Nazi Germany, Nazi Holland. Do we have any idea who's behind this cyber attack, and what kind of support does President Erdogan have amongst the diaspora, say, in Holland or Germany?
First thing is that some people have asked me over the last days whether we are close to a war with Turkey, which looks, of course, completely overstated. But I mean, this is an act of cyber war. Mm-hmm. So this is quite worrying. And we know that there are some ultranationalist hacker groups in Turkey who have been acting probably coordinated with the Turkish authority at some point, because after Gezi, the Turkish government has put into place the whole, organization to watch the social media in Turkey. Sure. And so they're very attentive. They're really following that closely.
So we're running out of time, unfortunately, Dorothée, but just one last question very quickly. Could this spat call into question Turkey's adhesion to NATO?
That's the next point. What looks absolutely unbelievable is that now there are many analysts in the US who are discussing openly the presence of the Turks in the NATO. And that was not the case even 2 years ago. It was impossible to question that.
Well, Dorothée, we've run out of time today. Thank you very much for coming on the programme today.
Merci.